chapters and articles on a variety of topics in numerous volumes and scholarly journals, but I wish to concentrate here on his engaging books on themed spaces. In 2007, Scott published The Themed Space, Locating Culture, Nation, and Self, which contains 15 articles on themed spaces such as Coney Island's Luna Park, Japanese love hotels, and flagship locations by popular brands. His book, Theme Park, which was published in 2008, is richly illustrated and lucidly examines the theme park from a variety of perspectives, including theme park as machine, the theme park as brand, and the theme park as tax. And finally, the Immersive World's Handbook, Designing Theme Parks and Consumer Spaces, published in 2013, is even more visually stunning. Using numerous charts and illustrations, the book is a how-to guide for designers on how to create immersive and themed spaces. Over the years, Scott has received several awards, mostly for his teaching. In 2003, he was honored with the Hayward Award for Excellence in Education in the state of California. In 2005, he was the recipient of the McGraw-Hill Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching of Anthropology by the American Anthropological Association. And I've heard just a few days ago, he received the Lake Tahoe Community College Distinguished Faculty Award 2013. Congratulations. Thank you. So you can see there are a lot of reasons that we are very proud that he's here with us today to talk about Coney Island and the history magic of theme parks. So please join me in welcoming Professor Scott Lucas.
I'll let you switch that. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's kind of large.
Yeah. That'll take a few.
Okay.
Do you need it right now?
At the beginning, it kind of, yeah. What's it? Why isn't it open? It opened before.
I know.
Huh.
Let me check once more.
You can always try that. What does it say? It's newer version. Oh, on the flash drive, go back to the lower version, the PPT instead of PPTX.
Okay.
On the flash drive.
Flash?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's saying it needs a different version,
okay,
so it should be plugged in. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And let's try this. This is the one, right?
I think so. Okay, yeah, and then Talks Minds, History Magic, and then, yeah, that one, the old PPT, instead of the, yeah,
okay.
it's a lower version, so, oh, perfect. That's why I have both versions. Perfect, okay. All right, great. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Thank you, Dr. Freitag, and everyone who has made it possible for me to be here for these lectures and the class I'll be doing. Thank you all for coming today to listen to this talk. And if you are interested, you can also download the full version of this talk and the charts and so forth from the website listed here. One of the most curious ways to initiate a study of the historical significance of the amusement and theme park is to begin at the perceived end, the case of the ruin of the theme park. Throughout the early history of American amusements, the many parks of Coney Island burned no less than 6 times, a fact made more startling given the fact that live firefighting shows were a staple of its 2 parks. The circumstances of these emulating amusement parks are as notorious as are the many attractions that were destroyed and in some cases rebuilt within them. There is further irony as we continue to gaze at the photos. Here, the Promethean spirit of human amusement history is channeled into an Icarian one as we reflect on the existential sense that such great monumental amusement parks, indeed the very ones that made possible the theme parks of Disney, Six Flags, and Universal today, could flicker out of existence in such singularity. Walter Benjamin's angel of history now being blown back into the present. Not unlike these burned amusement parks, there is a second form of the ruin that offers an equally intriguing glimpse of what appears to be the finitude of the amusement park. It is found in the many cases in which an amusement or theme park is abandoned and left to decay amidst the wilds of nature. In each of these cases, so it seems, a certain shift occurs in which nature reclaims what the spirit or culture had once taken, and this becomes the state of the ruin. As Georg Simmel notes, this shift becomes a cosmic tragedy which, so we feel, makes every ruin an object infused with our nostalgia. For now the decay appears as nature's revenge for the spirit having violated it by making a form in its own image. Reviewing the many cases of amusement decay in Six Flags New Orleans, Nara Dreamland, Camelot, Takata Noma Greenland, Wonderland, Splendid China, we notice a certain presence of the parks in their architecture, however decayed, and in their embeddedness in their natural surroundings. Yet we are equally struck by the desolation that is represented in these images. The absence of people in these spaces, the graffiti, rust, trash, and brokenness, all resembling a space of existential possibility and danger, not unlike the zone in Andrei Tarkovsky's film Stalker. When we get to River Country, the water park that along with Discovery Island was abandoned by Disney and left to decay not unlike the great ghost town of Bodie, California, we notice an even more profound version of the ruin. To quote Simmel once more, "The ruin strikes us so often as tragic, but not as sad, because destruction here is not something senselessly coming from the outside, but rather the realization of a tendency inherent in the deepest layer of existence of the destroyed." The sense of the ruin in terms of Simmel's existence of the destroyed is further highlighted in various before and after images of river country that enthusiasts have posted online. History as the ruin suggests an evocative channel of connection to amusement's past. Magic has an exceptionally significant focus in cultural anthropology. Early evolutionary anthropologists, such as Sir James Frazer, viewed magic as a primitive science and, important to this study, as being related to misapplications of the association of ideas. Frazer and other evolutionists believe magic to be a form of bad science that failed ultimately in its approach to analogy. As Pamela Morrow succinctly states, magic refers to beliefs and behaviors in which the relationship between an act and its effect is not empirically or scientifically verified, but from a Western perspective rests on analogy or a mystical connection. Throughout this study, I will stress the relationships of history and magic by referencing the roles that analogy, metaphor, and conceptual association play in the world of public popular amusements. The significance of magic to the theme park may seem quite obvious. A quick perusal of theme park imagery would note the many ways in which magic is deployed as a performative consumerist aesthetic that promises the guest, young or old, an experience of fantasy. Of course, the uses of magic in these theme park contexts connote less of the anthropological idea of magic as an attempt to manipulate the natural world, and more of the idea of magic as an inexplicable and remarkable influence producing surprising results. The magic of a Disney theme park, as constituted in millions of iterations ranging from guest visits to theme parks to later reflection of the magic of Disney on blog posts and on social media, relates quite closely to the associations of magic that people have when watching an illusionist or magician on stage. Part of the fun, perhaps most of it, relies on the fact that the viewer cannot determine cause and effect or understand how a certain physical act was achieved. Throughout my piece, I will utilize magic in a conceptual or metaphorical way and draw attention to 4 ways in which history is envisioned in magical ways. History magic, as I call it, refers to the motivations, interpretations, and deployments of history, whether in evolutionary, cultural, consumer, personal, or other senses, in ways that on the surface appear to be meaningful, logical, truthful, or persuasive forms of analogy, metaphor, or conceptual association, but which are, on the contrary, fabulous, political, mystical, rhetorical, and performative forms of analogy, metaphor, and conceptual association. To return to the context of stage magic, I would argue that history magic is an appeal to illusion or special effects in which there is greater consequence in exposing the secrets of the trick to a wider audience. I will analyze 4 specific motivations or ways in which history as a magical entity acts through the myriad worlds of amusement and theme parks. In my many years of studying theme parks and theme spaces, I have found myself coming back again and again to the historical example of Coney Island. As I offered earlier, the 4 parks of Coney Island were nothing short of remarkable in terms of their mechanical and technological thrills, uses of spectacle, monumental architecture and material culture, and numerous references to cultures, peoples, and events from around the world. Very recently, in a popular culture class that I teach, I screened an important documentary called Coney Island, The American Experience, directed by Rick Burns. My purpose in showing my students this film was to provide them with a historical context, a historical contrast of the amusement parks of Coney Island and the modern versions of Six Flags, Disney, and Universal theme parks. My students were quite fascinated with the many glimpses into Coney's past and were thoroughly surprised with the scale of many of the attractions, the sense of spectacle, the many precursors to today's theme parks, ranging from animal attractions, stunt shows, uses of theming, and technologically advanced rides. At some point in the discussion, it occurred to me that my use of Coney Island as a contrast to contemporary theme parks and theme spaces was a most curious endeavor. One of the most recent curiosities related to the historical status of Coney Island occurred during work on the Immersive Worlds Handbook. I was surprised that the technical advisors to the project, who are also professional designers within the theming industry, were less than excited about Coney Island's influence on contemporary amusements. In the book, I offered a short sidebar that expressed admiration for the impresarios Boynton, Tulio, Thompson, Dundee, and Reynolds, and the many ways in which their attractions influenced later theme parks. While the sidebar was included in the final version of the text, it was included with some degree of controversy. Was I, perhaps, being nostalgic about Coney Island, wishing that it were, in some way, the version of amusements and theming in the present instead of a Six Flags, Disney, and Universal version? David Lowenthal, in his influential work, The Past is a Foreign Country, suggests that the past, especially the nostalgic past, offers familiarity, reaffirmation and validation, identity, guidance, enrichment, and escape. What Lowenthal illustrates is how a past, such as that of Coney Island, can be used for multiple purposes that often include an appeal to nostalgia. My own reflections on the significance of Coney Island, which have oscillated between the sense of Coney Island's influence on contemporary theme parks and theme spaces, and the sense that Coney Island's history and distance from us today provides a powerful critique of the directions taken by contemporary amusements and consumer spaces, both suggest strong senses of nostalgia. Nostalgia, as we will see shortly, reflects a certain form of history as culture magic. Culture magic refers to the ways in which a certain past motivates the present and the future. On the one hand, such magic appears as an almost reified force, seemingly acting on the present without regard for human actors, and on the other, it appears as a tendency within the actor who chooses how and when to deploy history in the present. A few years ago, I discovered an interesting current case of Coney Island's history that I felt would assist me in my theories about the nostalgic appeal of amusement spaces. As I mentioned, Luna Park, which was open from 1903 through 1944, was one of the most influential of Coney's 4 main amusement parks. In the late 2000s, I became aware of an effort that would ultimately restore at least part of the legacy of Coney Island and Luna of old to the current Coney Island area in New York. During my own visit to Coney in this period, I was struck with 2 sensibilities. First, I was somewhat surprised to see so many references to Coney Island's past. This was quite a contrast to my experiences with the designers, who I found often lacked empathy and appreciation for the amusement parks of the past. The nearby subway station had numerous and extensive references to Coney's legacy, as did many of the shops that used reference to George Tilyu's iconic funny face, and even one case in which a display encouraged a consideration of history through oral memory projects. My second sensibility was one of lost, fueled by my nostalgia for Coney. Perhaps it was the fact that the leftovers from Coney's parks were now part of a well-intentioned but somewhat proletarian museum, or the site of the former parks now occupied by more utilitarian spaces like furniture stores. The reflection that documents of historical importance should not be hung atop urinals in the restrooms, or that certain attractions like Shoot the Freak are pale in comparison to the grandeur of the attractions of Steeplechase, Luna, and Dreamland of old. Damn the nostalgia, I might say, lest I forget David Lowenthal's notion that nostalgia is memory with the pain removed. Following my return from Coney and the publication of my book Theme Park, which dedicates a good deal of attention to the fact of Coney's influence on theme parks and theme spaces of the present, I received a call from the Municipal Art Society in New York. Among other groups, the Municipal Art Society was creating a vision plan for the realization of current-day Coney Island. One of the Society's main projects was called Imagine Coney, and it asked participants from around the world to submit their ideas for the revitalization of Coney. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, many of the respondents offered a nostalgic version that paralleled mine. Many referenced Coney Island's history as a, quote, unique brand, and stated ideas like, Coney Island should keep what's left of its history while adding new attractions. I want the new Coney Island to still be Coney Island. To return to Lowenthal's notion of nostalgia we see here, and in many other examples from Coney Island, the sense that people seem less concerned to find a past than to yearn for it. My own submissions to the Imagine Coney project reflect similar tendency towards history, the need to develop rides that pay homage to the history of the 4 parks of Coney Island, the significance of recognizing Coney Island's historic past, and the idea of bringing back lost themes from the past and allow these to speak in the present in the new Coney Island. Throughout the planning for the new Coney Island, competition seemed to develop between a vision of a modern, one might say Walt Disney-like version, and another more nostalgic Tilyou-like version. Local historical activists like Dick Zigun argued against a new Coney that would resemble a Nike town or one with overtly commercial appeal. Like the others, Zigun's reference was Coney's past, including, it should be noted, some of the quirky, sideshowy forms that have all but been eradicated in the clean, safe, hospitable Disney theme park environment. Newspaper editorials and announcements of the new Coney offered a more balanced negotiation of the past and present. These forms of culture magic offered ideas that Coney could effectively merge the nostalgia for the past with a more economically profound vision of commercial success. As plans evolved and more public discussion ensued, the initial impetus for the new Coney was the visage of Luna Park. My excitement about the new Luna Park project was fairly profound. After all, my obsession with Coney Island once led me to bid a rather high price on an original Luna Park program, which I won and which was the only such version of the program that I have ever seen. When Luna Park opened on May 29, 2010, there was much anticipation about this, the first of many visions for the new Coney Island. On first appearance, we see some tribute to the past, notably the reproduction of the iconic entrance of the historic Luna Park. On closer inspection, we see some signs that the idea of a historical synthesis of Coney Island nostalgia and contemporary developmental aims may be less possible than once imagined. On review sites like Yelp and TripAdvisor, and on individual blog sites, many have expressed concerns about the new version of Coney Island. Some provided that the new Coney Island is too touristy, but others interestingly compared Luna's lackluster attractions to Six Flags. Others seem to enjoy this remake of Coney, especially its cleanliness, and some suggested that the Coney of old is left only to dreams. The most interesting of these offered a visual comparison of two of the entrance areas of the old and the new, but then suggested it's still surrounded by derelict buildings and a beach littered with glass. So calling it the new Luna Park, even in tribute, is like calling Justin Bieber the new Frank Sinatra. It just feels kind of wrong. So to return to the idea of culture magic, we might appreciate the great difficulty that we face when we attempt to confront two very different versions of amusement history that are somehow related. As Bronislaw Malinowski wrote in Coral Gardens and Their Magic, the uses of magic are often connected to the levels of risk associated with a certain activity or sphere of life. It seems to me that the uses of history magic are equally connected to the risks associated with the context of history involved. Such is the case with Disney's theme park, the failed theme park, Disney's America. In 1994, testimony was taken up by the U.S. Senate that focused on the nature of theming at the proposed Disney's America theme park. The park would have included historical reconstructions of a Civil War-era village, President's Square, representing the genesis of American democracy, a Native American-themed area, a Civil War-era themeland, complete with a Coney Island-like Monitor and Merrimack battle reconstruction, the landmark of Ellis Island and its representative ethnics, a factory town that denoted the American Industrial Revolution, and a victory field that referenced the American proclivity for warfare. The proposed theme park itself is an interesting object for anthropological analysis, but what I find most curious about the controversy surrounding Disney's America are the many ways in which history, specifically of the Civil War, played a monumental role in Disney's eventual decision to abandon plans for the theme park. Some critics attack the plan from a public works perspective, arguing that transportation, housing, and other infrastructure issues would seriously weaken the area near Manassas, Virginia. But most interesting were the many historians and anthropologists, including Mike Wallace, who attacked the plan because it was envisioned as a theme park. For them, the idea of representing history and culture as a theme park was unthinkable. I believe that this dynamic controversy from the 1990s had four sources. The first refers to dark theming, which draws on Malcolm Foley and John Lennon's notions of dark tourism. Dark theming indicates the movement of theming into the realm of unconventional tropes, new approaches to material construction, and abandonment of purely modernistic sensibilities. Irony, ambiguity, and what Georges Bataille offered as the low are now found in more themed spaces than in the past. A dark historical event like the Civil War offers both an interpretive center and a theme park, a rich and evocative tapestry for guest interpretation. But because of its content, it is of no surprise that Disney's America was met with significant political resistance. A second reason for the controversy has to do with the forms of thematic expression. As this chart indicates, when critics consider the merits of a space, especially in the context of a serious topic like the Civil War, there is concern that a given space will result in substandard representation of history and culture, particularly in a venue like a theme park, which is traditionally considered by critics as a space that privileges consumerism over education, the north-south axis on the chart, which is similarly considered to be immersive as a form, but due to its branded and consumer nature, offers the patron less likelihood of openness or the ability to explore the complexities of the topics in that patron's consciousness, the east-west axis on the chart, we can then see that the form of the space itself perhaps doomed any hopes of Disney's America ever opening. A third related reason may be referenced through the idea of the sobriety of history. Early in the debates over Disney's America, satirical cartoons like this one began to appear that ultimately mocked the idea of Disney dealing with a serious topic. Likely, it wasn't much of a help to Disney's cause when Disney officials offered, "We want to show the Civil War with all of its racial conflict. We want to make you feel what it was like to be a slave or what it was like to escape through the Underground Railroad." In response to such statements, historian William Styron questioned that Disney's approach could do anything but mock a theme as momentous as slavery. No combination of branding iron slave ships or slave cabins, shackles, chained black people, or treks through the Underground Railroad could begin to define such a stupendous experience. Such notions of the sobriety of history, however, seem only appropriate were one to discount the representational politics of any theme space, including museums of history. Consider as one example the discussions of the ideological heavy-handedness of the Smithsonian's The Price of Freedom, Americans at War exhibit. To suggest that Civil War history could be presented within a sober museum space seems to deny such political and ideological manifestations. A fourth and perhaps most significant reason behind these many controversies of Disney's America can simply be called the dogma of real history, with real in scare quotes, of course. Following Disney's backing down from the plans for the theme park, then CEO Michael Eisner offered nothing short of an apology to historians and history itself. Our debate is not with historians. We respect them, and more important, respect our history. Perhaps more astonishing than Eisner's statement was another made in 2012 for a retrospective on the controversy in the Washington Business Journal. In this review of the fight over history, Christopher Miller of the Piedmont Environmental Council offered that Disney was going to interpret American history in a state that has 13 Civil War battlefields. History should be natural and original, not interpreted. What an apologia indeed. And now we can all conclude that there is a history that is natural and original, and all the while free from the messiness of interpretation. Finally, I believe that these four reasons behind the Disney's America's controversy are all forms of the magic of process. Process magic is the name that I have given to appeals to history that have, at their heart, some notion of legitimate analogy. To this magic I attribute both the designer who makes certain decisions about which historical details to include in a themed environment, and the social scientist or critic who makes equally important decisions about which of the historical and cultural details chosen by the designer to then analyze or critique. The process of this form of history magic thus refers to both the ways in which the designer chooses, evokes, and embellishes history within a space, and the ways in which the social scientist or critic assesses and comments on those choices. Analogy, especially of the forms that Hayden White describes in his important study of the uses of metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony in the book Metahistory, can be said to be directly tied to forms of legitimation in which both the social critic, leery of the ways in which history are used, and the designer, who is perhaps too eager to deploy these very ways in material spaces, in which both of these make truth claims about history and its later interpretation. In either case, as a project magic, it might seem that we're witness to Nietzsche's admonishment of the uses of history in which the dead seek to bury the living. Describing the architecture of Main Street USA at Disneyland, specifically the interpretation behind it in Marceline, Missouri, the Imagineer's state, it is more closely tied to Walt Disney's memories of Marceline than the reality of what Marceline was at the time. This is an example of heightened reality, a design technique used to invoke feelings of nostalgia, whether historically accurate or not. Heightened reality is a staple of the Imagineering toolbox, giving us the artistic license to play more directly to our emotional attachment to design details rather than to strict adherence to historical accuracy. Disney's evocative description of the inspiration behind Main Street USA reflects quite directly the sense of what I refer to as image pleasure magic. Like the homeopathic magic described by James Frazier, this form of Disney history magic relies on the use of conceptual association that is based on the principles of similarity. Using the semiotic terms of C.S. Peirce, we see that there appears to be a motivated connection of the signifier, Main Street USA, and the signified, Marceline, Missouri, and other main streets from across the United States. A naturalness in terms of the connections of these two different forms. To reference the Imagineers once again, all of these examples rely on the same formula. Take the things people know from the world around them, select the ones that suit the story you wish to tell, and combine them into something that is entirely new but still feels oddly familiar. The sense of familiarity that people feel as they interact with the architecture and material culture of Disney theme parks highlights how image pleasure magic works. History is brought to bear on the present in familiar symbolic forms that reference the past, other places, and other cultures. Were one to closely analyze these historical forms that are materialized in theme parks, the analyst would no doubt note a Peircean-motivated connection of signifier and signified, but more so a Saussurean connection of more arbitrary means. But this, of course, is the effect of magic, in which analogy and conceptual association is made opaque. To return to the earlier Disney quote, we now see that it is not accidental that the knowing they reference in their discussion of Main Street USA is in quotations. It is not knowing in an in-depth, analytic, critical sense, but a more mysterious, rhizomatic, sensual sense of knowing. This knowing, in the quotes, which is perhaps not unlike the difference between kennen and wissen in German, is the source of image pleasure magic. This form of magic suggests that the theme park guest may achieve great forms of pleasure, personal connection, education, even existential affirmation by gazing on the facades created in the space. Not all of this references a past. Indeed, in some cases like Tomorrowland, there is emphasis on the World's Fair traditions, and these project a similar magic that is nonetheless located in the future. For the ones that do reference a distant or even a more recent past, whether a Roman Colosseum, an Old West town, or a quaint 1950s American Main Street, the past is deployed using the analogy of this theme park is the past. Now, it's important to reference the knowing of the Imagineers at this point and acknowledge that Disney does not typically claim to be generating any sense of the real, not that the real exists, not any sense of the real past. Indeed, they clearly state that they are offering versions or alternate histories in their material culture, architecture, and performative forms of theming. As we saw in the case of Disney's America, historians and critics were offended with the magical ways in which Disney planned to consider the Civil War. The contentiousness of Disney's use of history centered on the idea of a faulty or mistaken past. What we see in Disney's version of history as facade it is a mere representation of past places, cultures, people, and events. We see the argument about a faulty past played out on the pages of many critical studies of Disney and other consumerist locales that rely on history. One of the arguments leveled is that the process that is used to construct the faulty facade-based past is fundamentally flawed. Using an example of a themed casino like the Venetian Las Vegas, we might say that we're one to explore the pasts that gave rise to Venice's material, cultural, social, economic, and other forms are based on a near infinite set of undifferentiated and connected multiplicities. In the case of a remake of Venice, such as the Venetian Las Vegas, these multiplicities are reduced to a few selective instances. The designer picks and chooses the instances to highlight, perhaps due to emotional, psychological, symbolic, cultural, economic, or existential reasons, and then deploys these in methods that call to mind the Imagineer's discussion of theming and familiarity in the minds of guests seeing Main Street, USA. I have referred to one of the modalities through which the designer picks and chooses historic and cultural types as culture sampling, or the tendency to draw on or sample a culture for the purpose of recreating and remixing that culture or numerous variations of it in another place. Not unlike musical and technological forms of sampling, culture sampling plays off the tendency of deploying a small quantity of something from which the general quality of the whole may be inferred. Equally relevant to culture sampling is the idea of meme theory, in which certain samples of a greater whole become emblematic and etched in the consciousness of individuals. Culture samples and memes often become the design inspirations for mood boards and other representations of the core of a themed space. As we return to the case of the Venetian Las Vegas, we see that the magical analogies of these two versions of Venice are not only, at their heart, arbitrary symbolic constructs, but we also recognize that these are based on the principle of a selective use of the past. So therein lies the problem, in that the image pleasure magic of history as a facade machine results in what many critics claim is an inauthentic citation of the past. Arguably, we should, as critics and citizens, be concerned about the uses and misuses of the past. Yet at the same time, we might acknowledge the fundamental problems with any past, and especially any use of the past that is fundamentally an appeal to authenticity or some version of the politics of the truth. Nietzsche reminds us of the faultiness of antiquarian history with its highly restricted field of vision, and how it assigns to the things of the past no difference in value and proportion which would distinguish things from each other fairly, but measures things by the proportions of the antiquarian individual or people looking back into the past. One potential solution to the troubles that Nietzsche associated with truth-driven versions of the past is to reconsider the politics associated with the deployments of the past. One of the most provocative analyses of the many versions of the past has been offered by archaeologist Cornelius Holtorf. Holtorf coined the term pastness to refer to the quality or condition of being past. Pastness is related to material cues, correspondence with the expectations of the audience, and plausible and meaningful narratives that connect past and present. Holtorf's view of the past allow us, as one example, to bring together the images of a Roman-era dwelling and a Disney theme park attraction that has been made to look old, complete with patinas. Such juxtaposition may itself seem to be a magical approach, and to some degrees it is. However, I believe that the ultimate value of theoretical considerations of pastness as they are applied to theme spaces is the opening up of more critical dialogue about the precarious relationships of consumer spaces and topics like authenticity. I am not by any means suggesting that we jettison any hope of finding the past. Indeed, it is my suggestion that any view of the past, whether it is found in a theme park, a history museum, or at a conference paper, or during a conference session at a historical meeting, any of these versions ought to be governed by a critical appreciation of the complexities of history and its interpretation, and perhaps most notably, by a reflexive understanding of its use. This leads me then to the final form of magic that connects us directly to the politics of the past as they are played out in the minds of individual actors or reenactors. For many years, the study of theme parks, themed environments, and many other consumer spaces has focused almost exclusively on analyses and models that emphasize the critic's point of view. Notions of simulation, inauthenticity, hegemony, and commodity fetishism dominate many studies of theme spaces. The actor's or agent's perspective, whether a designer of a theme space, a worker there, a guest who comes to visit it, has been noticeably absent from many studies of theme spaces. In this final form of magic, I am interested in addressing the significant ways in which forms of history are used by the actor, whether a worker in a theme space who may experience theme living, or a historical reenactor who may experience the rush of transcendence. Reflexive magic, then, is the use of history on the part of the actor to achieve some greater sense of history in which history itself becomes part of the person. In this most intimate of the forms of analogy that I've considered, we see that reflexive magic relies on the association of I am history. In my research that relates to my former work as an employee trainer at Six Flags Astroworld, I've been particularly interested in the close, even intimate relationships that exist between workers and theme spaces. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild has written of the significant ways in which forms of emotional labor, affect, and the labor of the managed heart have come to dominate the service industry. As I have written, theme parks are domains of service in which these forms are exceptional. While at Astroworld, I train new employees on the values of effective service performance, and much of this training emphasized that effective service work was synonymous with performance, improvisation, and everyday interactions with guests that fit in with and embellished the themes throughout the park. What became curious to me was the extent to which worker performance was, in some cases, transformative in terms of the worker's identity. As Hochschild has said of service work, by taking over the levers of feeling production, by pretending deeply, the worker alters herself. What interests me in terms of feeling production are situations in which the worker's self-identification with his or her thematic and performative work goes beyond the levels of typical service worker expectations. In these cases, situations of lived theming developed. This refers to the movement of the material elements of theming into the realm of the immaterial. It refers to situations in which workers or patrons of themed spaces psychologically take on the characteristics, values, or attributes that are connoted by the particular themes of these venues. In addition to this research on lived theming within theme parks, I have been especially interested in the context of reflexive magic that develop within the worlds of historical reenactment. This is a rich world of theming that is deserving of its own lengthy study. The most common forms of reenactment center around the recreation of famous historical events, most notably the American Civil War. But there are numerous other examples. The Kölnerstämme, or Cologne tribes, who take on the roles of indigenous peoples, Native Americans, Romans, Vikings, Huns, and Mongolians. Viking reenactments in Norway and Denmark, the many participants in LARPs, or live-action role-playing games, and the many contexts of living history, such as at Colonial Williamsburg, Conner Prairie, and Plymouth Plantation, all in the United States. One of the significant issues involved in all of these forms of reenactment and living history is that of authenticity, and here I believe reflexive magic takes an interesting turn that distinguishes it from the other three types I have considered. As I have offered in analyses of Civil War reenactment in the Immersive Worlds Handbook, there are different degrees of historical authenticity that relate to the commitments of the reenactors involved in the dramas. One of the clear tricks in reflexive magic is that authenticity is often in the mind of the beholder. As Wayne Curtis once remarked in reference to Las Vegas, something authentic is simply something that looks as you imagine it might. One could view this side of authenticity as it relates to historical reenactment as problematic, but I believe that this is an issue only if we fall back into the trap of assuming one valid history that can be discovered in the world. In addressing the ways in which reenactors assimilate and recreate the context of history in their own minds and actions, the work of the British archaeologist R.G. Collingwood comes to mind. Though Collingwood does not have our Civil War history reenactors in mind when he formulated his controversial idea of reenactment, we can see that his notion of history has profound relevance to our study today. As Giuseppina de Ora wrote, Collingwood suggested that when historians reenact the thought of an individual agent, they do not reenact a thought of a similar kind, but the very same thought of the agent. This notion of reenactment, not unlike historical reenactment in themed spaces, is an extremely challenging proposition. Going beyond traditional historical understandings and analyses, and even beyond empathic connections with historical actors from the past, the assumptions of both Collingwood's reenactment and the many contexts of historical reenactment in living history seem to suggest an almost telepathic, collective unconscious, or a mystical connection between actors and events in different times and spaces. I hope to address many of these contexts in future works, yet I believe we can develop some useful insights on this matter today. In my interviews with Civil War historian and reenactor Gordon Jones for the Immersive Worlds Handbook, I discovered something quite unique about the ways in which reenactors enacted the past. The reflexive spirit in which reenactors engage with history has suggested to me that historical reenactment and living history are fruitful grounds on which to study, contextualize, and build on the past. As Gordon Jones states, Civil War reenactment is about the human desire to transform imagined images of the intangible past into a more tangible present, not unlike the way a painter paints or the sculptor sculpts. What Jones points to is the sense that reenactors and others engage in close affective connection with theme spaces, is that there is an interest in extending their perceptions of the past, other cultures, and theme spaces in ways beyond consumption and the typical ills associated with consumer spaces and the culture industries. I have expanded on these notions and suggest 8 ways in which the connections between these agents and theme spaces approach profound levels. These include consciousness, affect, depth of consideration, pedagogy, transformation, life connection, politics, and quasi-religiosity and transcendence. These magical deployments of history through reflexive means do provide the actor agency and personal empowerment. And in some ways, we might add that the actions of these agents extend the project of history with a capital H in the sense that we keep the memes or core ideas of history alive and present in the minds of other actors. But at what costs? Some critics, like Glenn LaFantasi, have expressed doubts about this level of personal engagement with history. LaFantasi, like many historians, considers hardcore reenactors to be engaged in romanticized retellings of the Civil War, often glamorizing certain aspects of the war or playing the most popular roles, or in other cases, to be too focused on entertainment, not unlike professional wrestling in his mind. And to return to the engagement that many Civil War reenactors have with the past, LaFantasi says, Civil War reenactors live and breathe the war readily, without hesitation, and with a passion that veers close to a religious experience or even sexual arousal. In his mind, the sort of intimate proximity agents experience in cases of live theming, historical reenactment, and living history is too close for comfort. But as I have suggested earlier, I believe that there is value in the explorations of reflexive history that live theming and historical reenactment create. Like all histories, whether academic or popular, we need to be open to radical engagement with the narratives being told, and we should also be open to their hearty critique. Michel Foucault once said that history becomes effective to the degree that it introduces discontinuity into our very being, as it divides our emotions, dramatizes our instincts, multiplies our body, and sets it against itself. Effective history deprives the self of the reassuring stability of life and nature. It will uproot its traditional foundation and relentlessly disrupt its pretended continuity. And it is with Foucault's notion of effective history that I suggest that we consider how we might indeed reckon with the many magical pasts that I have addressed today. One of the most significant etymological meanings of analogy is that of reckoning. So often, whether in conducting historical analyses of theme spaces or in situating our own understandings of self in terms of such spaces, we are unable to, or at least unwilling, to engage in critical reckoning of the past. As I suggested in terms of Foucault's notion earlier, history's role in terms of depriving the self of the reassuring stability of life is one of the most powerful senses of how the past, especially that detailed in the study of public amusements, can indeed be reckoned with. In the cases of magic that I have considered, there's a certain risk on the part of the participants in the history magic. As I offered earlier with Malinowski, magic is often deployed due to the risks involved in any sphere of life. In the case of the uses and misuses of history, we see that there are incredible risks and high stakes involved in the many cases that we have considered, ranging from the monumental Disney's America project to the politics of Civil War reenactment. In all cases, magic, metaphorically, and here in return to Fraser's suspicious view of its bad science traits, magic involves analogy, the linkages of past and present, the interpretations of the past, and certainly the debates over the truth of the past. In the 4 cases of history magic that I have discussed today, I have avoided as much as possible any semblance of the politics of the truth as they relate to these constructions of history. Indeed, Nietzsche would remind us that the very metaphors, analogies, and conceptual associations that sustain our lives and perhaps provide us with some of its most positive affirmations are at the same time ones that corrupt us and lead us to a very ugly politics of the truth. While it's hard for me to think of how we might spatialize Nietzsche and place his important thoughts back into the context of public amusement spaces, I believe that this very thing has been done in 2 such spaces. The first is the Museum of Jurassic Technology, created by David Wilson in Culver City, California. Stepping into the museum for the first time, a visitor is likely to experience some of the same sensations that people in the 16th century did when they had explored a cabinet of curiosities. Journalist Edward Rothstein described the museum as a museum about museums. Others have called it a 3-dimensional conceptual art piece in which the visitor is placed in an incredibly and surprisingly precarious position as compared to visitors in most museums. Cosmonaut dogs, rotting dice, paintings on the head of a pin are just a few of the exhibits that this museum has featured. As one digs deeper into the exhibits, the guest discovers a very interesting state of verisimilitude. It becomes difficult to distinguish the truthfulness of the displays in this museum. A visit to the bookstore and the person may discover a text that provides academic background on one of the exhibits, but the problem is that many of the citations in these texts, like these displays, are rabbit holes. Certain people listed in them cannot be tracked down using internet searches, and some of the presses listed in the citations seem to have never existed. During my visit to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, my most reflexive moment came when I perused a display that presented the story of an explorer who discovered a species of bat that has the ability to pass through solid walls. There's even a block present that purports to have one of the space-bending bats inside of it. The second space is Dennis Seaver's house, located in Spitalfields in London and created by the late American expatriate Dennis Seavers in the 1970s. Like the Museum of Jurassic Technology, this venue is difficult to categorize. Visitors walk through the many floors of a Georgian house and vicariously experience the lives of a family of Huguenot silk weavers. Some have called the space an example of still life drama, if there is such a thing. Historical periods merge in the many exhibits which are interspersed with poetic narratives that sometimes admonish the visitor to not apply preconceptions to the spaces and to simply try and take it all in. Seavers once said that the goal of the space was to, quote, create what turned out to be a collection of atmospheres, moods that harbor the light and the spirit of various ages. On my visit to the space, I was struck with a sense of the monumentality of history, but not of the sort that I have experienced on visits to museums like the British Museum. Here, I believe, I was forced to consider the more meta levels of history. Once again, I was back home in the worlds of magic and analogy. But it was Seavers who said late in his life, "Sadly, I have recently come to accept what I refused to accept for so long, that the house is only ephemeral, that no one can put a preservation order on atmosphere." Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a truly magical talk.
which took us from Coney Island to spatialized versions of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Quite a roller coaster ride. And I do think that we have some time for questions left. So I open the floor for questions. If you have any, feel free.
Well, that's the spirit of Nietzsche, right here.
It kind of gives me a chance to bring in a point that because at the beginning, rather towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a point that I think has become more and more important in the context of theme parks, and that is nostalgia. Nostalgia not only as a very common strategy that theme parks use, but theme parks as the objects of nostalgia. You showed us this website, Coney Island History. There is a website dedicated towards extinct attractions from Disneyland and Walt Disney World and other Disney parks. And this is what I think is most interesting about this. There is even a section of one of Disney's newest theme parks, California Adventure, which is dedicated, themed to a theme park. Yeah. Could you do you see some more examples or general tendencies?
Yeah. I think it's, in fact, there are quite a few. If you go to Blackpool Pleasure Beach in England, on the west coast of England, there's this referencing of the past I've written of before, where I think there's an appeal to it, almost saying like, it's a place where this amusement or theme park came from, and particularly for the older amusement parks like Blackpool Pleasure Beach, or if you go to Kennywood Park on the east coast of the United States. I think that history, I don't want to use the metaphor again, but it does have a sense of magic because it suggests a continuity of the past and the present. And for some of the folks involved in this Coney Island project, the concern really was to say, could we bridge these two? Could we take the past that used to be Coney Island and realize that we can't entirely recreate it in the present? Can we fuse that with consumerism and the interest of the person in the present day age? And for me, this is an opportunity for historians or lay people or anthropologists to take part in these interesting considerations of how history can be bridged or not. And when you get to those points where you realize maybe it can't be bridged, to go back to Nietzsche, I would say we're at a good point where we realize that there's something problematic there. Or to go back to Foucault's notion, it's pushing us in a new direction. Or Benjamin's Angel of History saying there's something here to be looked at because it's creating, in what seems to be a discontinuity, a sense of point of consideration that we can fall back on and develop and analyze and critique and expound on, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Very much. My problem is history.
Right.
And it's not a fiction movie from Hollywood.
Right.
So I think the question of a historic theme park is not possible to put.
Yeah, this is, I think, such an important question. I think it goes back to this notion of maybe which history or whose interpretation, because I would say in any museum we could find fault. For me, as a metaphor, goes back to Borges, the writer Borges' notion of trying to create this, in his essay on finitude in science, he talks of this analogy where a group of people thought that the way to create the very best map of the world was to have a map that had a one-to-one scale. In other words, you would create a map that would lie, that was the size of the world, right? So it's sort of this question of exactness and finitude, where can you ever have a representation of something that is going to relate to how things were, or is going to speak to the needs to balance consumerism with history and with pedagogy and education. I've spoken to many designers, and in fact, if you go to the big, the theming entertainment conferences, I don't have the numbers, but I would say close to half of the folks there come from museums, historical interpretation centers like the Polynesian Center in Hawaii, big museums like the Field Museum in Chicago, and these are individuals who realize that they're in fact competing with the attention of the guest or the customer with theme parks, with video games, with media and multimedia that we see everywhere around the world. So I think one of the results of that is, in a sense, the theme park maybe draws on some of the history to try to make itself seem more profound and meaningful and pedagogical, like in Disney's America. And then the other side is that the History Museum is drawing on the interactive technologies of the theme park. But I think the question becomes, you know, whose history and who sorts it out in the end. Because you could have someone reading a historical account of, in the United States, someone could be reading, you know, this conservative critic Bill O'Reilly wrote a book about the JFK assassination. And I think, would I really want maybe my students reading this book? I don't know, maybe they could read that book and another book and balance it. But this is a question of everyday life and any history that we try to recreate. And of course, our notions of history are mediated by our own experiences, and whether we're academics or laypersons, whether we've researched something that we're studying and reenacting. So I think it's the core question maybe that we could use to channel further questions about history museums or theme parks, or when we're sitting down and reading a book that purports to be a true version of some historical event of the past. So it's a great question for, I think, future debate, I would say. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say, I think it's a profound effect, and I guess it goes back to this term I use, culture sampling. And I think, on the one hand, it presents stereotypes, and you're very correct there. Walt Disney was brilliant at taking forms of the past, folk songs and folk tales from the 16th, 17th century, and recreating those in new ways. And in fact, I encourage you to watch a video available online for free called RIP, a Remix Manifesto. And that particular documentary talks about this very issue and suggests that the irony today is that Disney did this very effectively. He used folk tales, and he took these and recreated them and created theme parks and animated films and stories and tales that became consumerist and that became prolific and that spread and became part of the new folk tales of people in the United States and other places. The problem is that now Disney, of course, is trying to protect, and through copyright infringement and patents and so forth, these as trademarks. And for many people, that seems rather ironic given the fact that they borrowed so much from world cultures and other places and remixed or culture sampled these entities and remade them in new forms. So I think the effect is quite profound, and what I would say to link all three of these questions is to say perhaps that it's incumbent on us, you know, when we're reading these about these sources, when we're visiting these spaces, when we're teaching our kids about the past or folk tales or contemporary versions of this, of powerful myths, is that we contextualize everything and try to draw out how these myths or stories originated and perhaps give some sense of the context and be very critical of them. And again, I wasn't saying in my talk today we shouldn't be critical. We certainly should be critical of the stories being told, whether they're the stories of the past, the ancient myths, or the remixes of those myths that are used today in Disney versions. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, then I would like to thank you once again.
Thank you very much
for your talk. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for being our audience. And
Yeah, great. So thank you. Thank you very much. I forgot to hit record on the camera. I don't know.
I don't think so. I actually saw
Was there a picture going? Oh. Huh. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.